Chapter 26 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joseph DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 26. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, to judge by the height of the sun above the horizon, and about with which we must be contented, owing to the watches having stopped on account of the immersion. If Barrosso's men had not followed the explorers, it was not so with the chimpanzees. A dozen of them left the troop with the evident intention of escorting the intruders. The others remained around the encampment. As he walked, the bargeman looked sideways at the savage bodyguard, who answered him with abominable grimaces and threatening gestures and gruff exclamations. Evidently, he thought, these brutes are talking amongst themselves. I am sorry I cannot understand them. It would be a pleasure to converse in their language. An excellent opportunity this, to make philological observations, and ascertain if, as Garner the American says, the higher apes have vocal sounds expressive of their different ideas, such as wh for food, chi for drink, eek for take care. In fact, if in the simian tongue a and o are missing, I is rare, e little used, and u and ou are the fundamental vowels. It will not have been forgotten that the document found on the island in the Gulf of Oman gave the particulars of the island in Mayumba Bay, and mentioned the position in which the sign of the double K marked the site of the treasure. On the first island, it was on a promontory to the south that the search had to be made and was made. On the second island, on the contrary, it was on one of the northern capes that one of the rocks bore the monogram. It was on the southern side that the shipwreck had occurred. Consequently, the exploring party had to march northward a distance of about a couple miles. There was nothing surprising in the two legatees being in advance of the group. They walked quickly, without exchanging a word, and would have allowed none of their companions to get in front of them. Every now and then, the notary gave an uneasy look at Sauk. He had no doubt but that he had arranged some villainy with the Portuguese captain. There was one thought he could not get rid of, that if Antifer lost the treasure, his commission would probably go the same way. Once or twice he tried to talk to Sauk, but Sauk, with gloomy eye and angry look, feeling himself perhaps watched by Jules, did not reply. In fact, Jules' mistrust was greatly increased when he noticed how Ben Omar treated Nazim. Even in an Alexandrian office, it is not customary for the clerk to command and the notary to obey, and there could be no doubt that it was with these two personages. The bargeman thought of nothing but the chimpanzees. Now and then his good-looking face would respond to their grimaces. His eye would close, his nose turn up, his lips protrude. Nonan and Enogate would certainly not have recognized him when he abandoned himself to these simian distortions. Enogate. Ah, poor child. Assuredly at this moment she was thinking of Jules, for she was always thinking of him. But that this very day he had been shipwrecked and was marching amid an escort of chimpanzees. Never. No, never could she have imagined that. In this latitude, at this time of year, the sun describes a semicircle from east to west as it passes near the zenith. Consequently, the rays it projects in these countries are not oblique, but perpendicular. The torrid zone is well named, for the zone is literally torrified from dawn to eve. And these jokers do not seem to be warm, said the bargeman looking at the chimpanzees. It is enough to make you wish you were an ape. To avoid the solar rays, it might have been worthwhile to advance under the trees, but their trunks began to branch so low down that the forest seemed impenetrable. Unless you were an ape, as Tregeman wished to be, and could travel among the branches, it would have been impossible to have found a passage. And so it was along the shore that Antifer went, skirting the creeks, avoiding the high rocks rising here and there like menhirs, and stumbling over the stones where he could not find any on the sandy beach clear of the rising tide. Is it not a difficult road, hard to the feet and rough to travel, which leads to fortune? He might sweat blood and water if necessary, but it would not be too much if he was to be eventually paid at the rate of £1,000 for every step he took in approaching his goal. An hour after they left camp, they had only gone a mile. That is, half as far as they wanted. From this place, the northern points on the island were visible. 3 or 4 ran out from the rest. Which was the right one? Unless they were exceptionally fortunate, they would probably have to search them all under the terrific meridian heat. The bargeman was quite done up. "Let us rest a moment," he entreated. "Not a moment," replied Captain Antifer. "But, uncle," said Jewel, "Tregamain is visibly melting." "Let him melt." "Thank you, my friend." And at this reply, Tregamain, who did not want to remain behind, resumed his march. It took another half hour before they reached the place where the 4 points branched out. The difficulties of the road increased. Some of the obstacles appeared insurmountable. What an indescribable chaos of shingle and ridges of quartz. Really, the place had been well chosen, and Camelique had had a happy knack of hiding treasure which might have been envied by the monarchs of Bassora, Baghdad, and Samarkand. Here ended the wooded part of the island. Evidently, the chimpanzees had no intention of going further. They did not willingly leave the shelter of trees, and the sound of roaring waves has no attraction for them. When the escort stopped at the edge of the trees, it was not without manifesting intentions that they were anything but conciliatory with regards to the strangers who were pursuing their explorations toward the extremity of the island. What howls they uttered! One of them picked up some stones and threw at them, and as the others followed his example, there was some danger of Antifer and his companions being stoned to death. And this is probably what would have happened if they had been imprudent enough to reply, as they were not equal to their aggressors either in strength or number. "Do not reply! Do not reply!" shouted Jewel, seeing Tregamain and Saouk picking up some stones. "Nevertheless," said the bargeman, whose hat had been knocked off by a stone. "No, Tregamain, no! Come further away, and we shall be safe. They will not come any further after us." This was the best to do. 50 yards more and they'd be out of range of the stones. It was then 10:30. To the north, 3 points ran out into the sea for 150 or 200 yards. It was the longest one, to the northwest, that Antifer and Zambuco decided to visit first. Nothing could be more barren than this mass of rocks, some of them firmly buried in the sand, others scattered and rolled about by the sea during the bad weather. No trace of vegetation, not even of lichens coating the humid blocks, not even a scrap of seaweed, so abundant on the shores of the temperate zones. There was nothing to fear with regard to the monogram of Camelique Pasha. If it had been inscribed on one of these rocks 31 years before, it would certainly be found intact. Our explorers began their search exactly as they had done that on the island in the Gulf of Oman. It may hardly be believed, but the two legatees were so possessed by their passion that they seemed to suffer no fatigue from their trying march under the burning sun. And Saouk, in the interest of his master, for who would have imagined it was for his own sake, set to work with indefatigable zeal. The notary sat between two rocks, and neither moved nor spoke. If they discovered the treasure, there would be time enough for him to intervene and claim the commission to which, being present, he was entitled by the provisions of the will, and he certainly would not be overpaid, considering the tribulations he had undergone during 3 long months. We need hardly say that by Captain Antifer's orders, Jewel remained near him, and began a methodical examination of every foot of the ground. "It is not very likely," he said to himself, "that we shall find the millions here. First, it is necessary that the treasure is buried on this island, and not on one of the other islands of the bay. Secondly, it must be buried on this point. Thirdly, we have got to find among the massive rocks one that bears the double K. But if all these circumstances combine, if it is not a hoax on the part of the abominable Pasha, if I put my hand on the monogram, would it not be better to say nothing about it? My uncle would then give up this deplorable idea of marrying me to a duchess, and Enougate to a duke. Well, no. My uncle would never recover from such a blow. He would go out of his mind. My conscience would tell me I had acted dishonorably. I must go on with this thing." And while Jewel was indulging in these reflections, the bargeman was seated on a piece of rock with his arms swaying, his legs hanging down, his cheeks streaming, puffing like a seal come to the surface after prolonged immersion. The investigations proceeded without result. Antifer, Zambuco, Jewel, and Saouk hunted about, patting all the rocks which by their position might bear the precious monogram. In vain were 2 wearisome hours devoted to this operation, up to the very end of the point. Nothing. Nothing. And, indeed, was it likely that a place would have been chosen exposed to the beatings of the surf and the violence of the waves? No. After the search was over on this promontory, would they resume it on the others? Yes, they would resume them the next day, and Antifer would recommence his work on another island if he failed on this one. Having found no trace, the group returned from the point, examining the rocks and the sand as they came. But there was nothing. At present, the only thing to do was to get back to the camp, embark on one of the boats, and cross to Mayumba. As Antifer, Zambuco, Jewel, and Sue came back from their search, they saw the bargeman and the notary still where they had left them. Antifer and Zambuco, without uttering a word, went toward the edge of the forest, where the chimpanzees were waiting for them. Jewel rejoined Tregamain. "Well?" asked the bargeman. "Not a sign of a double, or even a single K." "Then we must get back?" "Just so. Get up. Let us be off to the camp." "Get up?" "Yes, if I can. Come, give me a hand, my boy." And with a vigorous haul from Jewel, Tregamain rose to his feet. Ben Omar was already upright near Sauk. Antifer and Zambuco were 20 yards in front. From gestures and clamors, the chimpanzees took to action. A number of stones were thrown, and it became necessary to stand on the defensive. Evidently, these wretched chimpanzees intended to prevent Antifer and his companions rejoining Barroso and his men at camp. Suddenly a shout was heard. It came from Ben Omar. Had the notary been hit by a stone in some sensitive part of his person? No. It was not a cry of grief that escaped him. It was a cry of surprise, almost a cry of joy. They all stopped. The notary, with his mouth open and his eyes shut, stretched out his hand at Tregamain. "There," he said. "There!" "What do you mean?" asked Jewel. "Have you gone mad, Ben Omar?" "No, there! The K! The double K!" replied the notary, in a voice choked with emotion. "The K? The double K?" they exclaimed. "Yes." "Where?" And they looked at a rock toward which Ben Omar seemed to be pointing, but they saw nothing. "But where, you animal?" asked Antifer, in a voice of fury. "There," replied the notary. His hand pointed at the bargeman, who turned and shrugged his shoulders. "See it?" said Ben Omar. "On his back." In fact, on Tregamain's jacket there was a clear enough impression of the double K. Probably the rock against which he had been leaning bore the monogram, of which the worthy man had taken an impression on his back. Antifer gave a great leap, seized the bargeman by his arm, and ordered him to return to the place where he had been sitting. The rest followed, and in less than a minute they were in front of a block of stone, on which the much sought-for monogram was perfectly legible. Not only had Tregamain sat with his back up against the rock, but he had sat right down on the place where the treasure was hidden. No one spoke a word. They set to work. For want of tools, the task would be difficult. Could they clear away these rocks with their pocket knives? Fortunately, the stones, eroded by the weather, could be pulled asunder without much difficulty. In an hour they might have the barrels in sight. Then they would only have to take them to the camp, and then to Mayumba. This transport might probably be difficult, and how could it be carried out without awakening suspicion? Bah! Who was going to think about that? The treasure first. The treasure from the tomb where it had been buried for a third of a century. They could see about the other things afterwards. Antifer worked till his hands bled. He would not abandon to another the delirious joy of feeling, of patting the precious casks. "At last," he cried as his knife snapped against a metallic surface. And then, what a yell there was! Good heavens! Not joy, but stupefaction, disappointment. Did his white face show? Instead of the barrels mentioned in Kamalik Pasha's will, there was an iron box, a box like that found on Island No. 1, with the monogram as usual. "Again?" Jewel could not help exclaiming. "It must be a hoax," murmured Tregamain. The box was pulled out of the hole, and Antifer opened it savagely. A document appeared, an old parchment, yellow with age, on which were traced these lines, which Captain Antifer read in a loud voice. "Longitude of Island No. 3, 15 degrees, 11 minutes east. After being noted by the co-legatees Antifer and Zambuco, this longitude is to be taken and communicated in the presence of the notary Ben Omar to Mr. Tyrcomel of Edinburgh, Scotland, who possessed the latitude of the third island." Then it was not in Mayumba Bay that the treasure was buried. They would have to search elsewhere on the globe by combining this new longitude with the latitude of said Tyrcomel of Edinburgh. And there were not two to share Kamalik Pasha's legacy, but three. "And why," exclaimed Jewel, Should we not be sent from this third island to 20 others, to 100 others? Come, uncle, are you so obstinate, so foolish as to run about all over the world? Without reckoning, said Tregomain, that if Cambaluc Pasha had made legatees by the 100, his legacy will not be worth troubling about. Antifer looked down on his friend and his nephew, gave him a pebble to grind in his jaw, and replied, Silence in the ranks. We have not got to the end yet. And straightening out the document, he read as follows. Up to the present, at some compensation for their trouble and expenses, the co-legatees are to each take one of the 2 diamonds deposited in this box, the value of which is insignificant compared with that of the other precious stones they are asked to search for. Zambuco threw himself on the box, which he snatched from Antifer's hands. Diamonds, he shouted. And there were in fact 2 magnificent diamonds, worth, so the banker said, 4,000 pounds the pair. It is quite that, said he, taking one of the diamonds and handing the other to his co-legatee. A drop of water in the ocean, said Antifer, slipping the diamond into one pocket and the document into another. Ahem, said the bargeman, shaking his head. This is becoming more serious than I thought. We shall see. We shall see. But Jules merely shrugged his shoulders, and Saul clenched his hands at the thought that never again would he have such a favorable opportunity. As to Ben Omar, who had not had the smallest brilliant for his share, in spite of the obligation laid on him by this third document, he stood there with his features drawn, his arms limp, his knees shaking just like a half-empty sack about to flatten out on the ground. It is true that Saouk and he were not in the same position as they were when they left St. Malo, ignorant that they were going to Muscat, or when they had left Muscat, ignorant that they were going to Luongo. Carried away by regrettable excitement, Antifer had let slip the secret he should have rigorously concealed. They had all heard the new longitude, 15 degrees 11 minutes east, and they had all heard the name of Mr. Tyrconnel, residing at Edinburgh in Scotland. We may be certain that if Ben Omar had not done so, Saouk had already engraven these figures and this address in his memory until he could write them in his pocketbook. And Antifer and the banker would have to be careful not to lose sight of the notary, or his clerk with the mustaches, if they did not want them to outstrip them on their journey to Edinburgh. There might be some reason for thinking that Nazim had not understood, as he did not understand French, but there was no doubt that Ben Omar would reveal the secret to him. And besides, Jules had noticed that Nazim had not concealed a feeling of satisfied curiosity when the figures of the longitude and the name of Tyrconnel had so imprudently escaped the lips of Captain Antifer. After all, what did it matter? In his opinion, it would be madness to submit again for the 3rd time to the posthumous fancies of Cambaluc Pasha. What ought to be done was to return to Luongo and take the first steamer on their way to the good town of St. Malo. Such was the wise and logical proposition that Jules made to his uncle. Never, replied Captain Antifer. The Pasha sends us to Scotland. We will go to Scotland. And if I devote the rest of my life to this search... My sister Talisman, added the banker, loves you too well not to wait for you, even for 10 years. Goodness, thought Tregomain, the young lady will be nearly 60. Observations were useless. Antifer had made up his mind. He would continue in pursuit of the treasure, although the legacy was reduced to a third by the participation of Mr. Tyrconnel. Well, Endegate would have to be content to marry an earl, and Jules a countess. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joseph DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 27. The possession of wealth leads almost inevitably to its abuse. It is the chief, if not the only cause of all the evils which desolate the world below. The thirst for gold is responsible for the most regrettable lapses into sin. Imagine a society in which there were neither rich nor poor. What evils, afflictions, sorrows, disorders, catastrophes, disasters, tribulations, misfortunes, agonies, calamities, despair, desolation, and ruin would be unknown to man. It was the 25th of June. The church was in Edinburgh. The preacher was the Reverend Mr. Tyrconnel. His eloquent address had lasted for an hour, and the attention of his congregation gave no signs of failing. The gospel tells us, he continued, that blessed are the poor in spirit, a profound axiom that the ignorant and irreligious have in vain sought to misunderstand. It does not say that those who are poor of spirit, imbeciles in a word, but those who are poor in spirit, and despise those abominable riches which are the source of evil in modern society. The gospel tells us to despise wealth, and if unfortunately we are afflicted with a superfluity of wealth, if silver is stored in your treasure chests, if gold flows into you, if diamonds and precious stones cling to your necks, your arms, your fingers like an unhealthy eruption, if you are among those whom men call happy in this world, although I think you are thereby unhappy, I say to you that your malady requires instant and energetic treatment if you wish to be saved. And the preacher, continuing, told his hearers that their only chance of safety lay in the giving their riches over to destruction. He did not say, distribute your wealth among the poor, give to those who have none. No, what he preached was the destruction of this gold and these diamonds and title deeds and bonds and shares, either by burning them in the fire or casting them into the water. In short, the Reverend Mr. Turcomel would have no compromise with the habits and customs of the world in which he lived. In appearance, he was a man of about 50, tall, thin, smooth-faced, with piercing eyes and a voice as penetrating as that of a preaching friar. Throughout the city he was well known. There were some who thought he was inspired. The people crowded to his sermons. Hearers he had many. Proselytes he had none. They listened, but they acted not. Among his listeners on this occasion were 5 strangers who knew nothing of English and would have known nothing of his discourse if a 6th stranger had not explained it to them. The 6 were, of course, Captain Antifer and Zambuco, Ben Omar and Sauk, Tregomain and Jewel. We left them on the island in Mayumba Bay on the 28th of May. We meet them again here in Edinburgh on the 25th of June. What has happened between these dates? After the discovery of the second document, all that could be done was to abandon the island to the chimpanzees, to avail themselves of the boat which had been attracted by the signals of the shipwrecked crew. Captain Antifer and his companions had returned along the shore, escorted by the chimpanzees, more demonstrative than ever, howling, growling, and grimacing, and every now and then assailing the explorers with volleys of stones. The camp was reached at last. A word or two from Sauk to Barroso told him that the plot had failed. It was impossible to steal treasure from those who had no treasure to steal. The boat moored in a little creek near the camp, took on board all the survivors of the Porto Alegre. 2 hours later, she dropped anchor off the sandy spit on which stands Mayumba. Our travelers, without distinction of nationality, were hospitably received at a French factory. They at once set out arranging for their return to Luongo. Joining a party of Europeans on their way thither, they had neither to fear from the wild beasts or the natives. But the heat was almost unbearable. When they arrived, the bargeman said that he was reduced to a skeleton. It was an exaggeration, of course, but it was not far from the truth. Luckily, Captain Antifer and his companions did not have to remain at Luongo very long. A Spanish steamer from Saint Paul de Luanda, bound for Marseille, happened to put in 2 days afterwards for repairs, which were effected in a day. Berths were booked on the steamer, with some of the money saved from the wreck, and on the 15th of June, Captain Antifer and his companions left the west coast of Africa, where they found 2 valuable diamonds, a new document, and a new disappointment. As to Captain Barroso, Sauk undertook to pay him later on, when he had got hold of the Pasha's millions, and the Portuguese had to be content with the promise. Joel made no attempt to argue with his uncle, although he fully expected that the campaign would end in some gigantic mystification. A change, however, began to come over the bargeman's opinion. Those 2 diamonds contained in the box on island number 2 had given him something to think about. If the Pasha, he said to himself, has made us a present of these 2 diamonds, why should we not find some more on island number 3? And when he talked to Joel in this way, Joel would shrug his shoulders and say, "Well, we shall see. We shall see." This was Antifer's opinion. As the 3rd legatee, the possessor of the latitude of the 3rd island, lived in Edinburgh. To Edinburgh he would go, and he had no intention of letting himself be outstripped in the race, thither by either Zambuco or Ben Omar, who knew the longitude, 15 degrees, 11 minutes east, which was to be communicated to Mr. Tyrconnel. He would not part company with them. They would go together to Edinburgh by the quickest possible way, and Mr. Tyrconnel would be visited by the whole of them. Of course, this resolve was not satisfactory to Saouk. He was now in possession of the secret, and he would much rather have acted alone, found the man mentioned in the document, obtained a position of the third island, gone there, and dug up the riches of Camalik Pasha. But he could not get away without awakening suspicion, and he knew that he was being watched by Jules. Besides, the only way he can go was by Marseille, and as Antifer was going to Edinburgh by the shortest way, and in the shortest time, by traveling on the railways of France and England, so could not hope to get there before him. He had therefore to resign himself to the inevitable. Once matters had been cleared up with this Mr. Tyrconnel, perhaps the attempt, which had failed at Luongo and Muscat, might succeed in Edinburgh. The passage was fairly quick, as the steamer made no calls at the byports. It was rough, certainly, and of course Ben Omar was landed like a package on the quay of La Joliette. Jules had written a long letter to Enoggate. He told her all that had happened at Luongo. He informed her of the new campaign on which their uncle's obstinacy was sending them. And who could say where the caprice of the Pasha might send them in the future? He added that as far as he could see, Captain Antifer was quite equal to running about the world like a wandering Jew, and that he would not stop until he was raving mad, which would assuredly happen before all was over. Jules had only just time to slip this letter into the post. Antifer was off in the fast train from Marseille to Paris, then by the express from Paris to Calais, then by boat to Dover, then from Dover to London, and then by the Flying Scotchman from London to Edinburgh. As soon as they had secured their rooms at Gibbs Royal Hotel, they started out in search of Mr. Tyrconnel, and to their great surprise, Mr. Tyrconnel turned out to be a minister. They found his address, and then found out that he was at the church, and to the church they went. Their intention was to introduce themselves to him when the sermon was over, to tell him their story. A man to whom they were bringing $1 million or so was not likely to complain at being intruded upon. At the same time, it all seemed rather strange. What connection could have existed between Camalik Pasha and the Scottish minister? Antifer's father had saved the Egyptian's life. Well. Zambuco had saved his riches. Well. Hence the feeling of gratitude he had shown towards these two. Were they to conclude that Mr. Tyrconnel possessed a similar right to recognition? Evidently. But under what peculiar circumstances could a minister have helped Camalik Pasha in any way? It must be so, however, for this minister was the depository of the third latitude necessary for the discovery of the third island. But when the treasure seekers saw the minister in the pulpit, it was evident that some other explanation would have to be sought for. He could not have been more than 22 when Camalik was thrown into prison at Cairo, by order of Muhammad Ali, and it was not likely that he could have rendered him any service before then. Was it his father, or his grandfather, or uncle who had put the Egyptian under an obligation? However, it was of no importance. The point was that this minister possessed the precious latitude, that before the day was out, they would know all about it. The sermon continued, the same thesis, with the same impassioned eloquence. An invitation to kings to throw their civil lists into the sea. An invitation to queens to throw their diamonds into the flames. An invitation to the rich to destroy every scrap of their wealth. Jules sat astounded, muttering to himself. Here is another complication. Decidedly Uncle will have no chance with this man. Can this be the sort of man the Pasha knew? Is it from this excited minister that we are to ask the means of discovering a treasure? This man would be only too eager to destroy it, and if it ever fell into his hands. Here's an obstacle we never expected, an insurmountable obstacle, which will bring our proceedings to a close. We shall get a peremptory refusal, a refusal to which we cannot reply, a refusal which will bring the reverend gentleman immense popularity. That will settle my uncle, and his mind will give way. Zambuco and he, and perhaps this Nazim, will do all they dare to get the secret of the minister. They are capable of everything. But if he keeps the secret? I do not know if, as he says, millions do not bring happiness, but running after those of the Egyptians certainly delayed mine. And if Mr. Turcomel refuses to cross this latitude with our longitude, which we have conquered at so much trouble, we can do nothing else than retire tranquilly to France, and... When God commands, we must obey, said the preacher at this moment. That is my opinion, thought Jules, and my uncle will have to submit. But the sermon did not end, and there seemed no reason why it should not last until eternity. Antifer and the banker began to give visible marks of impatience. Saouk bit his mustache. The notary, so long as he was not on shipboard, did not worry himself about anything. Tregamain, with his mouth open, his head nodding, his ears pricked up, tried to catch a word here and there, which he vainly endeavored to translate. If, said Antifer, he only knew the news I am bringing him, this preacher would soon get out of his pulpit. Would he? Asked Jules, in a tone so singular that Antifer frowned at him in a terrible way. But all things must end in this world, even a Scottish sermon. It had become evident that Mr. Turcomel had reached his peroration. His delivery became more labored, his gestures more violent, his metaphors more audacious, his objurgations more menacing. One more blow against the fortune holders, the possessors of the vile metal, with an injunction to throw it into the furnace of this world if they would avoid being hurled into that of the next, and then a supreme effort to the effect that when they were weighed in the balance, the weight of their gold would sink them to perdition. The sermon was over, and the preacher as suddenly disappeared. Captain Antifer, Zambuco, and Saouk had intended to interview him as he came out of church. Would they have to wait until the morning? Were they to pass the night in the tortures of curiosity? No, they would rush to the central porch. Jules and the notary and Tregamain followed them, but their endeavor was in vain. Evidently, Mr. Turcomel, to avoid an ovation, had escaped by a side door. To 17 North Bridge Street, said Captain Antifer. But, uncle... Before he goes to bed, we must see him, said the banker. But, Mr. Zambuco... No remarks, if you please. There's only one thing. What is that? Asked Antifer angrily. What he's been preaching about. And what has that to do with us? A good deal. You are making fun of us. I am quite serious, and I say that nothing could be more unfortunate for you. For me? Yes, listen. And in a few words, Jules had explained what had been the purport of the sermon, that all the millions in the world ought to be thrown into the sea. The banker was aghast, and so was Saouk, although he pretended not to understand. As for Tregamain, he indulged in a huge grimace of disappointment. Antifer alone remained unshaken. In a tone of bitter irony, he remarked, Fool! The only people who preach like that are those who have not a halfpenny to lose. We've only got to talk about the millions that are coming, and you will see if this Turcomel will throw them into the sea. Evidently, this reply betrayed a profound knowledge of human nature. But it was decided to give up the idea of visiting this reverend gentleman that evening, and the 6 travelers returned to Gibbs Royal Hotel. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Joseph DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 28. The house in which Mr. Turcomel lodged was in the neighborhood of Canongate, the windows looking out onto the valley in which runs the railway. It was a gloomy, uncomfortable house, up one of those sordid, insanitary alleys known as closes, running out of this historic thoroughfare, which, under different names, extends from the Palace of Holyrood to the Castle of Edinburgh, one of the 4 Scottish fortresses which by the Articles of the Treaty of Union have always to be kept in repair. It was at the door of this house that on the morning of the 26th of June, Captain Antifer and the banker Zambuco, accompanied by Jules, arrived, just as 8 o'clock was striking from the neighboring church. Ben Omar had not been asked to join them, his presence being useless at this first interview, and consequently, much to his disgust, Saouk was also absent. If the minister divulged the secret of the Latitude, he would not be there to hear it, and it would therefore be impossible for him to outstrip Antifer in the search for island number 3. As to the bargeman, he remained at the hotel, and, while awaiting the return of the visitors, amused himself by contemplating the marvels of Princess Street and the pretentious elegancies of the Scott Monument. As far as Jules was concerned, it had not been possible to dispense with him, as his uncle required his services as interpreter. It could be imagined how eager they were to find where island number 3 was situated. Saouk, it may be observed, was furious when he found himself left behind, and as usual, vented his anger on Ben Omar. "Yes, it is your fault," he shouted, knocking over some of the furniture, "and I have a great mind to pay you out with a good thrashing." "Excellency, I did all I could." "No, you did not do all you could. You should have forced yourself on this rascally sailor, and told him that your presence was necessary, and that you would be there. You would then have found out and told me about this new island, and I might have perhaps got there before the others. My plans were spoiled at Muscat. They were spoiled at Mayumba. Do you think they're going to fail again because you remain stuck there on your feet, like an old ibis stuffed with straw? I beg, and I swear that if I fail, it is your skin that will pay for it." The scene continued in this way, and became so violent that the bargeman heard the noise. He went to the door of the room, and was lucky for Saouk that he was speaking in Egyptian. If he had assailed Ben Omar in French, Treguarme would have discovered his abominable schemes, and learned who the so-called Nazim really was, and treated that personage as he deserved. But although this was not revealed to him, he was thoroughly surprised at the violence with which Ben Omar was treated by his clerk, and saw that the young captain's suspicions were fully justified. Entering the minister's house, Captain Antifer, Zambuco, and Jules began to ascend a wooden staircase with the aid of the greasy rope hanging on the wall. Never would the bargeman, thin as he might have become, have been able to make his way up these dark, narrow stairs. The visitors reached the landing on the 3rd floor, the last on this side of the house. In front of them was a small door in a recess, of which was the name Turcomel. Antifer uttered a vigorous grunt of satisfaction and knocked. The reply was a long time coming. Was not the minister at home? Why not? A man to whom you are bringing $1 million or so. A second knock, rather louder than the first. This time there was a slight noise in the interior of the room. It was not the door that opened, but a little hole just above the name. Through this hole appeared a head, that of the minister. "What do you want?" asked the minister, in a tone that showed he was not overpleased at being disturbed. "We wish to speak to you for a few minutes," said Jules. "What about?" "A matter of important business." "I have no business, important or otherwise." "Ah!" exclaimed Antifer, annoyed at so much delay. "Is he going to let us in?" But as soon as the minister heard him speak in French, he answered as if it were his native tongue. "Are you a Frenchman, then?" "Frenchman," replied Jules. And imagining that I might facilitate their introduction into the minister's room, he added, "Frenchman, who heard your sermon yesterday." "And who think of becoming converts to my teaching?" asked the minister. "Perhaps." "On the contrary," said Antifer, "he must be converted to ours, unless he chooses to give up his share." The door was opened, and the 3 visitors found themselves in the minister's presence. It was one room, lighted at the end by the window looking out over the ravine. In one corner was an iron bedstead, with a straw mattress and a counterpane. In another corner was a table with a few toilet utensils. There was a bench for a seat. There was a cupboard in which the minister kept his clothes. On a shelf were a few books and writing materials. There were no curtains, and the walls were bare. There was a table with a reading lamp, the shade of which was very low. It was a bedroom and a study, in which there was nothing that was not strictly necessary. The minister, who was all in black except his collar and tie, did not ask his visitors to sit down, and he had but one seat to offer them. In truth, if ever millions would be welcome anywhere, it ought to be in this cell, the whole contents of which are not worth 30 shillings. Captain Antifer and Zambuco looked at one another. How were they to open fire? As soon as their co-legatee began to speak French, Jules' intervention was unnecessary, and they became merely a spectator. He preferred to be so, and it was not without a certain feeling of curiosity that he awaited the encounter. Who would be the conqueror? At the outset, Captain Antifer felt more embarrassed than he had ever expected to be. After what he knew of this revolutionary minister, of his opinions regarding this world's goods, he judged it advisable to proceed with caution, to feel his way, to break the news gently, so as to persuade the minister to hand over the letter of Camalik Pasha, which ought to be in his possession, and which there could be no doubt contained the figures of the new and, let us hope, the last latitude. But Antifer had no chance of beginning. Whilst 3 visitors were forming a group in the back of the room, the minister placed himself in front of them in the attitude of a preacher. Persuaded that these men had come of their own free will to accept his teaching, his only thought was to enlarge on his principles with as much eloquence as he could muster. "My brethren," he said, clasping his hands in an outburst of gratitude, "I thank the author of all things for not having refused me that gift of persuasion, which has enabled me to instill in your hearts that contempt of wealth. Imagine the faces of the 2 legatees at this exordium. By destroying the wealth you possess," continued the minister, "which we do not yet possess," Antifer could not help saying, "you will give an admirable example, which will be followed by all those whose minds are capable of rising above the materialities of life." Antifer, by a sudden movement of his jaw, jerked the pebble from one side of his mouth to the other, while Zambuco whispered, "Are you not going to explain the object of our visit?" An affirmative sign was Antifer's reply, while he muttered to himself, "I must not let him give us his yesterday's sermon over again." The minister, opening his arms as if to receive repentant sinners, said in a full voice of unction, "Your names, my brethren, in order that—" "Our names, Mr. Turcomel," interrupted Captain Antifer, "are these. I am Pierre Servan Malo Antifer, retired coasting captain. This is Jules Antifer, my nephew, master mariner. This is Mr. Zambuco, banker of Tunis." The clergyman stepped to the table in order to write down these names. "And doubtless you bring me your worldly wealth, thousands perhaps?" "Well, Mr. Turcomel, we have come about millions, and when you have got your share, you can destroy it as you please. But as far as we are concerned, that is another matter." Antifer was off on the wrong tack. Jules and Zambuco saw this at once by the change which took place in the minister's face. His forehead wrinkled, his eyes half turned, his arms, which he had opened wide, fell on his chest as if they were shutting the door of a safe. "What, then, is all this about, gentlemen?" he asked, stepping back. "What is it all about?" asked Antifer. "Come, Jules, unroll the thing, for I should not be able to measure my words." And Jules unrolled the thing without reticence. He related all he knew about Camalik Pasha, the services rendered by his great-uncle Thomas Antifer, the obligations contracted with the banker Zambuco, the visit to St. Malo of Ben Omar, notary of Alexandria, the voyage to the Gulf of Oman, where lay island number 1, followed by the voyage to Mayumba Bay, where lay island number 2, the discovery of the second document, which sent the 2 co-legatees to a 3rd legatee, who was no other than the reverend gentleman to whom he was speaking. While Jules spoke, the clergyman listened, without making a movement, without permitting his eyes to brighten or his muscles to twitch. A statue of marble or bronze could not have been more motionless. When the young captain finished his story, and asked him if he ever had any business with Camalik Pasha, the minister simply replied, "No." "But your father?" "Maybe." "Maybe is not an answer," observed Jules, calming his uncle, who was turning about as if he had been stung by a tarantula. "It is the only answer I think it necessary to give," replied the minister, dryly. "Insist, Mr. Jules. Insist," said the banker. "In every possible way, Mr. Zambuco," replied Jules. And addressing the minister, who evidently intended to maintain extreme reserve, "May I ask you one question?" he said. "Only one?" "Yes, and I can answer it or not, as I please." "Is it within your knowledge that your father was ever in Egypt?" "No." "But if it was not Egypt, it might be Syria, or to be more precise, Aleppo." It will not be forgotten that it was in this town that Camalik Pasha had resided for some years before he returned to Cairo. After a moment of hesitation, Mr. Turkomel admitted that his father had lived in Aleppo, where he had met Camalik Pasha. There, no doubt, he had been of service to the Pasha, as had Thomas Antifer, in Zambuco. I will now ask you, continued Jules, if your father received a letter from Camalik Pasha. Yes. A letter in which there was some mention of the position of an island in which treasure was buried. Yes. And did not this letter contain the latitude of this island? Yes. And did it not say that one day a certain Antifer and a certain Zambuco would come and see you on this subject? Yes. Every yes fell like a hammer stroke, louder and louder. Well, continued Jules, Captain Antifer and the banker Zambuco are in your presence, and if you will show them the Pasha's letter, they will have only to make a note of its contents and be off to fulfill the intentions of the testator, of which you and they are the 3 legatees. As Jules spoke, Captain Antifer struggled in vain to keep still. The minister paused before he replied. And when you have reached the place where the treasure is, what are your intentions? To unearth it, of course, said Antifer. And when you have unearthed it? To divide it into 3 shares. And what are you going to do with your shares? Whatever we please. That is it, gentlemen, replied the minister, while his eyes glowed like fire. You intend to take advantage of these riches to satisfy your instincts, your appetites, your passions. That is to say, to contribute towards the increase of the inequities of the world. Allow me, interrupted Zambuco. No, I will not allow you, and I ask you this simple question. If this treasure falls into your hands, will you undertake to destroy it? Each will do with his legacy as he judges best, said the banker evasively. Antifer exploded. That is not it, at all, he shouted. Do you know what this treasure is worth? It makes no difference. It is worth 4 million pounds, and there's a third of that for you. The minister shrugged his shoulders. Are you aware that you are not allowed to refuse us the information the testator requires you to give? Really? Do you know that you have no more right to leave 4 millions unproductive than to steal them? That is not my opinion. Do you know that if you persist in your refusal, yelled Captain Antifer in a fury, we shall not hesitate to bring you to justice, to denounce you as a fraudulent legatee, as a criminal. As a criminal, repeated the minister angrily, but cool. Really, gentlemen, your audacity equals your absurdity. Do you imagine that I shall agree to spreading 4 millions over the earth to become the cause of 4 million sins the more? To stultify all my teachings and give my congregation the chance of flinging 4 millions in my face? Jules could not help admiring the preacher, while his uncle, wild with anger, was ready to spring on him. Yes or no, hissed Antifer, clenching his fists and stepping forward. Yes or no, will you give us the Pasha's letter? No. Antifer foamed at the mouth. No? No. Ah, I will make you give it to us. Jules interposed. His uncle pushed him aside. Antifer would have strangled the minister, searched the rooms, ransacked the cupboard, and it would not take him long to do so. But he was stopped dead by this simple and peremptory reply. It is useless for you to search for the letter. And why? Asked Zambuco. Because I have not got it. What have you done with it? I have burnt it. He has put it to the fire, gasped Antifer. The wretch! A letter containing the secret of 4 millions. A secret never to be discovered now. And it was only too true. Doubtless for fear of being tempted to make use of it, a use contrary to all his principles, the reverend gentleman had burnt the letter several years before. And now you can go, said he, showing his visitors the door. Antifer was overwhelmed at the blow. The document destroyed? The finding of the island impossible? And so it was with Zambuco, who burst into tears, like a child deprived of his plaything. Jules had to help the 2 legatees out onto the stairs, then into the road, and then, sorrowfully, they went back to the hotel. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joseph DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 29. Such emotions, disasters, anxieties, troubles, shocks, and alternations of hope and despair were too much for Captain Antifer. Even the constitution of a coasting captain has its limits. And as soon as Jules' much-harassed uncle reached the hotel, he took to his bed. He was attacked by fever, a violent fever, with delirium, the consequences of which might be serious. What deceptive illusions haunted him? This campaign interrupted just at the moment when it promised to end successfully. The uselessness of further search, this enormous treasure of which they would never know the position, this third island lost in some unknown sea, the only document that can give its exact position destroyed, burned by this abominable minister. This latitude, which not even torture would make him disclose, and which he had voluntarily and criminally forgotten. Yes, it was to be feared that Antifer's much troubled mind would be unable to resist this last blow. And the doctor called in haste, gave it as his opinion that there was every likelihood of the patient going mad. Every care was taken of him. His friend Tregemain and his nephew Jules would not leave him for a moment, and, if he recovered, would be entitled to his warmest gratitude. As soon as he returned to the hotel, Jules had informed Ben Omar, and through him Saouk learned all about Mr. Turcomel's refusal. The fury of the false Nazim can be imagined, but this time there was no outward manifestation of his anger. He kept it to himself, hoping that the secret which Antifer could not discover might be discovered by himself, and utilized for his sole advantage. This was the object on which he concentrated his attention, and during that day and the subsequent days, he was not seen at the hotel. When the bargeman heard what had happened, he remarked, "I think the matter is buried at last." "I think so too," said Jules. "It seems impossible to get anything out of this obstinate fanatic." "It is rather funny, though, to take millions to a minister and find him refuse them." "Take millions!" exclaimed the young captain, shaking his head. "You do not believe in them, Jules? You may be wrong." "How you have changed!" "Since the finding of those diamonds. I do not say that the millions are on the third island, but they may be there. Unfortunately, if this clergyman will not listen to anything, we shall never know." "Well, no, Mr. Tregemain, and in spite of the 2 diamonds at Mayumba, nothing will prevent my thinking that the Pasha has a huge hoax in store for us." "In that case, your poor uncle will suffer. What we have to do now is to get him well. Let us hope his head will stand it. When we have set him on his feet again, and he is strong enough to travel, he will, I think, agree to return to France, and resume his former quiet life." "Ah," said Jules, "would we were only in the house in the Rue des Hauts-Célestes. And you, near our little Enegate, my boy. By the way, did you think of writing to her?" "I wrote this morning, and said I thought we might now talk of coming home." A few days elapsed. The patient had become no worse. The fever had decreased, but the doctor was uneasy as to the mental state of his patient. Antifer, though his head was weak, was able to recognize Tregemain and Jules, and his future brother-in-law. Brother-in-law? Between ourselves, if any lady was in danger of remaining single, was it not Talisman Zambuco, now on the confines of 50, and waiting, not without impatience, for the appearance of her promised husband? No treasure, no husband, for one was the complement of the other. From all which, it resulted that neither the bargeman nor Jules could leave the hotel. Antifer was always asking for them. Day and night he kept them in his room, listening to his complaints, his recriminations, and above all, his menaces against the horrible minister. He spoke of nothing else than going to law with him. The judges would know how to make him speak. He could not keep silent when it meant keeping 4 millions out of circulation. He would be punished most severely, most terribly, might even be hanged, etc., etc. From morning to night, Antifer continued in this tone. Tregemain and Jules took it in turns to be with him, except when some violent crisis required them both to be present. The patient would have got up, rushed out of his room, run away to the minister, and blown out his brains if the bargeman's strong hand had not kept him down. Although he greatly desired to visit the superb city of Edinburgh, Tregelmain had to give up the idea. Later on, when his friend was on the road to recovery, he would make up for it. He would visit the Palace of Holyrood, the ancient residence of the Scottish kings. He would stroll along the Canongate to the castle, firmly planted on its rock, and see the little room in which the child came into the world who was to become James VI of Scotland and James I of England. He would make the ascent of Arthur's Seat and enjoy the view from its summit. Soon, a rumor arose calculated to greatly increase Mr. Turcomel's already considerable popularity. It was reputed that the celebrated preacher had, in conformity with his expressed opinions, just refused a very large legacy. Perhaps the minister had himself started the rumor, which was so much to his advantage. At any rate, there was an immense crowd to hear his next sermon. This time, for a very good reason, Captain Antifer and his companions were not present. But behind one of the columns in the nave, there might have been recognized a foreigner whom nobody knew, of from 30 to 35 years of age, with black hair and beard, hard-featured, and of any but prepossessing appearance. Did he understand the language in which the minister spoke? We cannot say that he did. Standing hidden in the shade, he watched the preacher narrowly. His gleaming eyes never lost sight of him for a moment. The man remained in this attitude until the close of the sermon, and, when the last words were spoken, made his way through the crowd toward the minister. Did he intend to follow him from the church to his house in the Canongate? It would seem like it, from the vigor with which he used his elbows on the steps of the porch. That evening, Mr. Turcomel did not return alone. A small crowd accompanied him. The mysterious man was one of them, but did not join in their expressions of enthusiasm. On reaching his house, the popular orator ascended some of the outer steps and addressed the crowd, and then retired, without noticing that an intruder was at his heels. The crowd slowly dispersed, and when the minister mounted the narrow staircase leading to the third floor, the unknown followed him as stealthily as a cat. The minister reached the landing, entered his room, and shut the door. The other stopped on the landing, cowered down in a dark corner, and waited. And then what happened? Next morning, the people in the house were surprised at not seeing the minister go out early as usual. They did not see him all the morning. Several visitors called and knocked at the door in vain. This appeared so suspicious that in the afternoon, one of the lodgers gave information to the police. The police came to the house, mounted the staircase, knocked at the door, and as they received no reply, broke it in, with that push from the shoulder peculiar to the officers of the force. What a spectacle! Someone had evidently picked the lock of the door, entered the room, and ransacked it from top to bottom. The cupboard was open and emptied of the few clothes it contained, which had been thrown on the ground. The table was upset. The lamp lay in a corner. Books and papers were scattered all over the floor, and near the bed, half-stripped, pinioned and gagged, was Mr. Turcomel. The police quickly set him free. He was only just breathing. He had quite lost consciousness. Since when? He alone could say, if he recovered. He was rubbed energetically. There was no need to take his clothes off, for he was almost naked. His shirt was torn from his back. His chest and shoulders were bare. The policeman who began to rub him could not restrain an exclamation of surprise. On Mr. Turcomel's left shoulder, some figures and a letter had been tattooed. The tattoo marks were legible enough, brown in color, on the minister's white skin. And this was the inscription: 77 degrees, 19 minutes north. As may be supposed, this was the much sought-for latitude. The minister's father, to prevent it being lost, had evidently had it tattooed on his son's shoulder when he was young, as if he had inscribed it in a notebook. A notebook might be lost, but not a shoulder. Thus it was that, although he had really burned the letter of Kamalik Pasha addressed to his father, the minister possessed this inscription so strangely placed, an inscription he had never had the curiosity to read with the aid of a looking-glass. But undoubtedly, the rascal who had entered the room while the minister was asleep had read it. The minister had found him ransacking his cupboard and looking over his papers. In vain had he struggled. After binding him and gagging him, the scoundrel had fled, leaving him half suffocated. Such were the details given by Mr. Tyrconnel, as soon as a doctor, summoned in haste, had restored him to consciousness. He related all that had passed. In his opinion, the sole object of the assault was to wrest from him the secret of the island of the millions he refused to disclose. The scoundrel, then, had found it out while struggling with him, and with regard to this, he spoke of the visit he had received from the 2 Frenchmen and a Maltese, come to Edinburgh to interrogate him regarding the legacy of Kamalik Pasha. Here was a clue for the police, who began their inquiries immediately. 2 hours afterwards, they discovered that the foreigners in question were at Gibbs Royal Hotel. And it was fortunate for Captain Antifer, Zambuco, Tregamain, Jewel, and Ben Omar that they could prove an incontestable alibi. Antifer had not left his bed. Jewel and the bargeman had not left his room. Zambuco and the notary had not been away from the hotel. And none of them answered to the description given by the minister. But there was Saouk. Saouk was the man. He it was who had gone to get the secret from Mr. Tyrconnel. And now, thanks to the figures he had found on that gentleman's back, he was master of the situation. He knew the longitude mentioned in the document found on the island in Mayuma Bay, and thus possessed the necessary elements for determining the position of the new island. Unfortunate Antifer! It needed but this last blow to drive him mad. In fact, after the description given in the newspapers, Captain Antifer, Zambuco, Tregamain, and Jewel had no doubt but that it was Nazim, this clerk of Ben Omar, with whom Mr. Tyrconnel had had to do. And when they learned that he had disappeared, they took it for granted that he had seen the figures that had been tattooed, and that he had started for the new island to take possession of the treasure. The least astonished of the party was Jewel, whose suspicions with regard to Nazim we know, and next to him, Tregamain, to whom the young captain had communicated his suspicions. The rage of Antifer and Zambuco was extreme, and it found a victim in the person of Ben Omar. We need scarcely say that Ben Omar was more certain than anybody of the guilt of Saouk. And how could it be otherwise, knowing as he did his intentions, and that he was the sort of man who would recoil at nothing, not even at crime? What a scene it was to which the notary had to submit. Jewel fetched him to the sick room. Ill as he might have been, Antifer was not the man to remain ill under such circumstances. If, as the doctor said, he was suffering from bilious fever, here was a splendid opportunity for him to relieve himself of his bile and bring about his own recovery. We really cannot describe the way in which the unfortunate notary was treated. He was told, to begin with, that the assault on the minister and the robbery, yes, you miserable Omar, the robbery, was the work of Nazim. What? Is that the way you choose the clerks in your office? Is this the sort of man that you bring to assist you as an executor? A nice sort of rascal, scoundrel, villain to thrust upon us. And now this wretch, this unscrupulous wretch, had fled with the position of island number 3, and he would get hold of Kamalik Pasha's millions, and it would be impossible to lay hands on him. Ah, Saouk! Saouk! The name escaped the overwhelmed notary. All Jewel's suspicions were confirmed. Nazim was not Nazim. He was Saouk, the son of Murad, disinherited by Kamalik for the benefit of the legatees. What? Exclaimed Jewel. It was Saouk? Ben Omar would have recalled the name if he could. His face, his terror, his dejection showed only too clearly that Jewel was not mistaken. Saouk! Roared Antifer, jumping out of bed with a bound. And with a tremendous kick, he laid the notary flat on his back. This kick, with the broadside of abuse that followed it, was a real relief to Captain Antifer. And when Ben Omar, with his shoulders up and his stomach in, tottered out of the room, he felt considerably better. One thing more completed the cure, and that was the news that appeared in one of the newspapers a day or two afterwards. We know of what reporters and interviewers are capable. Of everything, it must be admitted. At this period, they had begun to intervene in public and private affairs with a vigor and audacity that had made them a new power in the world. One of them had been clever enough to obtain an interview with regard to the tattoo marks with which Mr. Tyrconnel's father had illustrated his son's left shoulder. He made a drawing of it, and this drawing appeared next day in a journal, the circulation of which, on that occasion, was so phenomenal that in a short time the whole world knew of the famous latitude, 17 degrees, 19 minutes north. The public were so much the wiser, for before they could solve the treasure problem, as it was called, they required the other element of the position, namely, the longitude. But Antifer had this longitude, and so had Sauk for that matter. And when Jules brought him the newspaper in question, and he saw the drawing, he jumped out of bed, he put on his clothes. He was cured as never a patient had been cured before. "Jules, have you bought another atlas?" "Yes, uncle." "The longitude of the third island is 15 degrees 11 minutes east, is it not?" "Yes, uncle." "The latitude tattooed on the minister's shoulder is 17 degrees 19 minutes north, is it not?" "Yes, uncle." "Well, see where island number 3 ought to be." Jules took the atlas, opened up the map of the Arctic regions, applied the compasses, and remarked, "Spitzenbergen, the southern end of the large island." Spitzenbergen? What? Was it in this northern region that Kamalik had chosen an island for his millions? Was this the last island? "Let us go," said Antifer, "this very day, if we can find a ship ready." "Uncle!" exclaimed Jules. "We must not let this miserable Sauk get there before us." "You are right, my friend," said the bargeman. "Let us go," repeated Antifer imperiously, and he added, "Go and tell that fool of a notary, for Kamalik Pasha wanted him to be present at the discovery of the treasure." They had to bow to his will, supported as it was by the will of Zambuco. "Well," said Jules, "at any rate, it is lucky that this joker of a Pasha did not send us to the Antipodes." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joseph DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 30. Captain Antifer and his 4 companions, including Ben Omar, had to go first to Bergen, one of the chief ports of Norway. No sooner resolved upon than done. Nazim, otherwise Sauk, had a start of 4 or 5 days, and not an hour was to be lost. The noonday ball had not fallen at Edinburgh Observatory when the tram deposited our 5 friends at Leith, where they hoped to find a steamer on the point of sailing for Bergen. The distance from Edinburgh to this port is only about 400 miles. From there it would be easy to reach Hammerfest, the northernmost Norwegian port, by means of the steamer which, in the summer season, takes tourists to the North Cape. From Bergen to Hammerfest is about 800 miles, and is about 600 miles from Hammerfest to the south end of Spitzenbergen. For this last stage, a vessel would have to be chartered fit for the voyage, but at this period of the year, there is no bad weather in that part of the Arctic Ocean. There remained the question of money. This third of the voyage would evidently be very costly, particularly that part of it north of Hammerfest. Tregamain's funds had begun to run low, after so much expenditure since leaving St. Malo. Fortunately, the banker's signature was as good as gold. There are people so favored by fortune that they can dip their hands into any money chest in Europe. Zambuco was one of these. He placed his credit at the disposal of his co-legatee. The brothers-in-law could adjust their accounts afterward. The treasure, and in default of the treasure, the diamond, of the one would yield more than enough to pay what the other had advanced. Before leaving Edinburgh, the banker had visited the Bank of Scotland, where he was cordially received. Thus laden, our travelers can go to the end of the world, and who knows if they would not have to go there if things went on as they had been doing. At Leith, situated 1.5 miles from Edinburgh, on the Firth of Forth, there are always a number of vessels. If there was one outward bound for the coast of Norway, there was one. This time fortune seemed to favor Antifer. Though the said ship was not to start that day, she was due out next day. She was a trading steamer, the Viking. Here was a delay of 36 hours for Jules' uncle to fret about. He would not even allow Jules and Tregamain to take a stroll through Edinburgh, much to the disgust of the bargeman, notwithstanding the interest he had begun to take in the millions of the Pasha. On the 7th of July, the Viking left the docks, and 2 days afterwards sighted the heights of Norway, arriving at Bergen about 3 in the afternoon. We need scarcely say that before leaving Edinburgh, Jules had bought a sextant, a chronometer, and a nautical almanac to replace those lost in the Port Alegre. If they could have chartered a vessel at Leith, direct for Spitzenbergen, they would have saved time, but the opportunity did not present itself. Antifer's impatience, however, was not tried overmuch. The steamer for the North Cape was expected next day, but the few hours seemed as long to him as they did to Sambuco. Neither of them would hear of leaving their hotel. Besides, it rained, for it seemed that it generally rains at Bergen, which occupies a sort of basin surrounded by mountains. This did not prevent the bargeman and Jules from taking a run through the town. Captain Antifer, quite recovered from his fever, did not insist on their remaining with him. But all that was worth seeing they had seen when in the early morning the steamer came into harbor. At 10 o'clock she was off with her cargo of tourists, anxious to see the midnight sun on the horizon of the North Cape. This was a phenomenon of supreme indifference to Captain Antifer and Sambuco, and especially so to Ben Omar, who was in his usual state of collapse in his bunk. What most annoyed Antifer was the steamer's continual stoppages to satisfy the curiosity of the tourists. The thought that Saouk was several days in front of him kept him in a state of irritation that was anything but agreeable to his traveling companions. The remonstrances of Tregamain and Jules were of no avail, and the captain of the steamer threatened to put him ashore if he persisted in making himself a nuisance to those on board. Whether he liked it or not, Antifer had to put in at Drontheim, the old city of St. Olaf, which is not as large as Bergen, but more interesting. We need not be surprised at Antifer and Sambuco refusing to go ashore. Tregamain and Jules, however, took advantage of the delay to explore the town. If the eyes of the tourists were to a certain extent satisfied, their feet were not. The street might as well be paved with broken bottles, so pointed are the stones. Cobblers ought to make a fortune in this country, said the bargeman, judiciously trying in vain to save his souls from damage. The only acceptable pavement the two friends could find was under the arches of the cathedral, where the kings, after being crowned at Stockholm as kings of Sweden, come to be crowned as kings of Norway. After conscientiously visiting the cathedral and the vast cemetery that surrounds it, after following the banks of the wide Nid, whose waters, increased or decreased by the flow or ebb, flow through the town between long stockades of wood that serve as quays, after sampling the odors of the fish market, and visiting the vegetable market, almost entirely supplied from England, after venturing across the Nid to the suburb round an old citadel, Tregamain and Jules returned on board quite tired out. A letter addressed to Enegate, containing a pleasant postscript in the heavy handwriting of the bargeman, was that evening put in the post for St. Malo. Next morning, at daybreak, the steamer left, with a few new passengers, and resumed her voyage to high latitudes. There were more stoppages, more delays, much to the disgust of Antifer. In crossing the Arctic Circle, represented by a thread stretched across the deck, he refused to jump over it, though Tregamain good-humoredly complied with the tradition. At last, in advancing northward, the steamer avoided the famous Maelstrom, whose roaring waters turned in a gigantic whirlpool. Then the Lofoten Islands, so much frequented by the Norwegian fishermen, appeared to the west, and on the 17th, anchor was dropped in the port of Tromsø. To say that during the voyage it had rained 16 hours out of the 24 would be only just, according to the figures. But the verb to rain is quite insufficient to give an idea of such deluges. Anyhow, these cataracts were not displeasing to our travelers. They showed that the temperature was relatively high, and what was to be feared by men bound for the 77th parallel was the prevalence of the Arctic cold, which would have rendered very difficult, and even impossible, the approaches to Spitzenbergen. This period of the year, July, is late for navigation in these parts. The sea might suddenly close in at a change of wind, and if Antifer were detained at Hammerfest until the early ice had drifted south, would it not be dangerous for him to venture further north in a fishing boat? The thought of this made Jules anxious. And if the sea does close in, asked Tregamain, my uncle will have to winter at the North Cape and wait for next season. Well, my boy, we must not abandon the millions. The old mariner of the Rance no longer growled. And why not? He cannot get those diamonds found in Mayuma Bay out of his head. But having been roasted under the sun of Luongo, Was he to be frozen among the glaciers of Spitzenbergen? Confound that Pasha! What possessed him to bury his treasure in such extraordinary places? The steamer stayed but a few hours at Tromsø, where the passengers could for the first time make acquaintance with the natives of Lapland. And on the morning of the 21st of July, she entered the narrow fjord of Hammerfest. There, Antifer and his party landed. Next day, she would take the tourists on to the North Cape. Little did Antifer care for the North Cape. There was no North Cape worth comparing, as far as was concerned, with island number 3, somewhere in Spitzenbergen. But as there happened to be a North Pole hotel at Hammerfest, it was to the North Pole that they went. As soon as they had engaged their rooms, they went out, in their anxiety not to lose a moment, to endeavor to charter a boat to take them to Spitzenbergen. They walked towards the harbor, which is fed by the limpid waters of a lovely river bordered with stockades, on which were built houses and warehouses, the whole pervaded by the odors from the neighboring fish-drying establishments. Hammerfest is above all things the town of fish and every fishing product. The dogs eat it, the cattle eat it, the ship and goats eat it, and the hundreds of boats which work in these wonderful regions bring more fish than can be eaten. A curious town in Hammerfest, rainy as it might be, lighted by the long summer days, darkened by the long winter nights, and often illuminated by sheaves of the aurora borealis of inexpressible magnificence. At the entrance of the harbor, Captain Antifer and his companions stopped at the foot of a granite column with a bronze capital bearing the arms of Norway, and surrounded by a terrestrial globe. The column was erected by Oscar I, and is commemorative of the measurement of the meridian between Hammerfest and the mouths of the Danube. From this point, travelers directed their steps toward the stockades, at the foot of which were moored the vessels of all rigs and every tonnage employed in the major and minor fisheries of the Polar Sea. But you may ask, how were they to make themselves understood? Did any of the party understand Norwegian? No, but Jules understood English, and with the aid of that cosmopolitan language, there was every chance of his making himself intelligible in Scandinavia. In fact, before the day was over, they had on moderate terms chartered a fishing boat, the Kroon, of about 100 tons, commanded by Captain Olaf, and manned by a crew of 11. This would take the passengers to Spitzenbergen, wait there for them during their search, load up with any merchandise they might find, and bring them back to Hammerfest. This was fortunate for Antifer. It seemed that everything was going in his favor. Jules inquired if a foreigner had been seen at Hammerfest a few days before, if anybody had embarked for Spitzenbergen, and received replies in the negative to both questions. It seemed to Saouk, oh, you miserable Omar, had not got in front of them, or that he had gotten to island number 3 by a different route. The rest of the day was spent in walking about the town, Antifer and Sambuco being persuaded to do so on this occasion, as they were so near their goal. When they retired to rest at 11 o'clock, it was still day, and the twilight did not end before the dawn appeared. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the Kroon was off northward before a good southeasterly breeze. As there were some 600 miles to traverse, she would be about 5 days on the voyage, if the weather continued favorable. There was no fear of her having to meet with ice drifting southwards, nor of their finding Spitzenbergen surrounded by pack ice. The temperature remained at normal, and the prevailing winds rendered a sudden cold blast unlikely. The sky, dappled with clouds, which occasionally dissolved in rain, not snow, had nothing disquieting in its appearance. Now and then the cloud broke, and the sun's rays shot through the rifts. Jules had every reason to hope that the radiant disk would be visible when it became necessary to use the sextant for fixing the position of the third island. Evidently, their good fortune continued, and there was nothing to lead them to think that after bringing his legatees to the uttermost part of Europe, Kamali Pasha would send them once more several thousand leagues away. The Kroon went splendidly, the wind never failing her. Captain Olaf averred that he had never made a better passage. At 4 o'clock in the morning of the 26th of July, high land was reported to the northward, above a horizon quite clear of ice. This was Spitzenbergen, which Olaf knew well, from having frequently fished in these regions. 20 years ago, Spitzenbergen was not often visited by tourists, but nowadays it is gradually being embraced in their round. The time is not far distant when return tickets will be issued for the Norwegian possession, as they are now for the North Cape, and may eventually be for the pole of the same name. As far as was then known, Spitzenbergen was an archipelago extending to the 80th parallel. It is composed of 3 islands. Spitzenbergen, properly so called, the Southeast Island, and the Northeast Island. Does it belong to Europe or America? A question of purely scientific interest, which we need not stop to answer. One thing is certain, that it is chiefly Englishmen, Danes, and Russians who send their ships there for the whale and seal fisheries. It mattered little to the legatees of Kamalik Pasha, to whom these islands belonged once they had safely removed from them the millions earned by their courage and tenacity. Spitzenbergen, as the name indicates, is a land of pointed rocks difficult to access. The islands were discovered by the Englishman Willoughby in 1553, and their name was given them by the Dutchmen Barents and Cornelius. Not only does the archipelago consist of 3 principal islands, but these are surrounded by numerous islets. After marking on the chart the longitude of 15 degrees 11 minutes east and a latitude of 77 degrees 19 minutes north, Jules gave Captain Olaf orders to make for the southeast island, the most southerly of the archipelago. The Kroon scudded rapidly before a following wind, and the 4 or 5 miles which separated them from the islands were accomplished in less than an hour. The Kroon dropped anchor 2 cables off an islet which had a high abrupt promontory rising from its end. It was then 12:15. Antifer, Zambuco, Ben Omar, Tregamain, and Jules embarked in the boat and rowed toward the shore. An immense number of gulls, guillemots, and other polar birds flew off with deafening cries. A herd of seals rapidly shuffled off, not without protesting with mournful wailings against the intrusion. The treasure was evidently carefully guarded. Antifer leapt ashore and took possession. What curious good fortune after so many failures! He had not even to search amid the masses of rock. He had landed on the very spot where the Egyptian had buried his millions. The island was deserted, as need hardly be said. There was not a human creature on it, and there was not a ship in sight save the Kroon. Nothing but the immensity of the Arctic Sea. Antifer and Zambuco could hardly restrain themselves, and even the fishy eyes of the notary lighted up. Tregamain, more excited than he had ever been before, his back rounded, his legs far apart, was hardly recognizable, and after all, why should he not be happy at his friend's happiness? And what added to their joy was there was no mark of a footprint on the ground. Assuredly, no one had recently landed there. The ground, softened by the rains, would have retained any footprint. There was no doubt then with regard to Sahouk. Murad's terrible son had not preceded the legitimate owners of the treasure. Either he had been stopped on the way, or he had met with delays which would render his search useless if he arrived after Captain Antifer. When good fortune takes you by the hand, the best thing is to be led as she wishes you to be. Antifer was brought before a rock, rising like one of the landmarks set up by Arctic explorers. "Here! Here!" he exclaimed in a voice choked with emotion. They ran up. They looked. On the outer face of this rock appeared the monogram of Kamalik Pasha, the double K, so deeply incised that the rigors of the polar climate had not worn away its lines. All remained silent at first, as if they had arrived before the tomb of some hero. And then they set to work. This time pick and mattock rapidly made the chips fly at the foot of the rock. At every blow they expected the tools would ring on the metal hoops of a barrel, or stick into a stave. Suddenly Antifer's pickaxe grated against something. "At last!" he shouted, removing the piece of rock which covered the hole in which the treasure lay. But to this cry of joy succeeded the cry of despair, a cry so loud that it might have been heard for half-miles around. In the hole was a box, a metal box marked with the double K, a box just like those that had been found in the Gulf of Oman and in the Mayumba Bay. "Again!" groaned the bargeman, lifting his arms on high. That was the word. Yes, again! And again it would undoubtedly be necessary to go in search of another island. Antifer, in a furious passion, seized his pickaxe and dealt the box such a violent blow that it flew into splinters. From it escaped the parchment, spotted, stained, dilapidated, the damage due to the infiltration of rain and snow. This time there was not even a diamond for Turcomel, who had not been subject to expenses like his co-legatees. That was fortunate. A diamond for him? Why, he would have reduced it to vapor. But to our parchment. To pick it up, to unfold it carefully, for it might easily have torn, was what Jules did, for he alone retained his coolness. Antifer shaking his fist at the sky, Zambuco bowing his head, Ben Omar collapsing, Trégamain all eyes and ears. All were as silent as the grave. The parchment consisted of one sheet, of which the upper part had not suffered from the damp. On the sheet several of the lines were still legible. Joel read them, almost without interruption. This is how they ran. There are 3 men to whom I am under an obligation, and to whom I wish to leave a token of my gratitude. If I have placed these documents on 3 different islands, it is that these 3 men, made acquainted with each other during their voyages, might be united in an indissoluble bond of friendship. If they have had a certain amount of trouble and fatigue in arriving at the possession of this fortune, they have not experienced as much as I have in keeping it for them. These 3 men are the Frenchman Antifer, the Maltese Zambuco, the Scotsman Tyrconnel. In their default, if death has removed them from this world, their natural heirs will enjoy the same right to my legacy. In the presence, then, of the notary, Ben Omar, whom I have appointed my executor, this box having been opened, and notice having been taken of this document, which is the last, the co-legatees can proceed to the 4th island, where the 3 casks, containing the gold and precious stones, have been buried by my own hands. Notwithstanding the disappointment they felt at finding another voyage necessary, Antifer and the others could not help a sigh of relief. At least the 4th island was to be the last. But where was it? To find this island, continued Jewel, all that is necessary is to bring... Unfortunately, the lower part of the parchment had rotted away. The sentences were illegible. Most of the words had disappeared. The young captain tried in vain to decipher them. Island, situated, geometrical law. Go on, said Antifer. But Joel could not go on. There were only a few doubtful words which he sought in vain to connect together. As to the figures of the latitude and longitude, there was not left a trace. Joel began again. Situated, geometrical law. At last he made out another word. Pole. Pole? He exclaimed. What? Is it at the North Pole? Unless it is at the South Pole, muttered the bargeman in despair. Evidently here was the expected hoax. The pole. Now, the pole. Had ever a human being set foot on the pole? Antifer jumped at his nephew, snatched from him the document, tried to read it, stumbled over the few words that were only barely legible. Nothing to give him any indication of the whereabouts of the 4th island. He would have to give up all hopes of discovering it. And when he saw that the search was at an end, he was struck as if by lightning, and fell rigid on the ground. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joseph DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 31. On the 12th of August, the house on the Rue des Hautes Célestes at St. Malo was in a state of rejoicing. There was a wedding that morning, and the happy couple had left about 10 o'clock for the Marie and the church, amid a numerous gathering of friends and acquaintances. Jewel had married neither a princess, nor a duchess, nor a baroness. Enogate had neither married a prince, nor a duke, nor a baron. For want of the millions, their uncle's wishes had not been realized, and we have every reason to think that they did not regret it. 2 other personages were radiant with joy. Nanon, who felt sure of her daughter's happiness, and Gildas Trégamain, in a lovely new coat and trousers, and a silk hat and white gloves, who was acting as best man. Quite so, but how about Captain Antifer? An hour after the discovery of the document on island number 3, which ended in such disappointment and despair, the passengers of the Croon had returned on board, Antifer being carried in the arms of the sailors, who had been called up to help. So shattered had he been by the blow that he spoke not a word. The return voyage was accomplished as quickly as possible by sea and land. The Croon took her passengers to Hammerfest. The steamer from the North Cape landed them at Bergen. The railway from Drothheim to Christiania not then being open, they had to travel by road to the Norwegian capital. A steamer took them to Copenhagen, and thence the railways of Denmark, Germany, Holland, Belgium, and France brought them to Paris, and so home to St. Malo. At Paris, Antifer and Zambuco bade each other farewell. Both were dissatisfied. Talisma Zambuco would probably remain single for the rest of her life. It was written above that it was not Antifer who was to save her from this undesirable position, against which she had struggled for so many years. It need scarcely be said that all the monies advanced to Antifer for the expenses of the voyage were repaid to Zambuco, and they amounted to a good round sum. But the sale of the diamond realized enough for there to be balance left, and Antifer had no cause of regret on this head. Ben Omar paid his own expenses, and departed for Alexandria by the shortest way, declaring that he would never again venture on a treasure hunt. The next morning, Antifer and Tregamain and Jules returned to St. Malo. And what a welcome they had! Nanan and Enelgate had nothing but affectionate consolations for their brother, uncle, cousin, and friend. And then it was that Captain Antifer, finding it impossible to endow his niece and nephew with millions, gave his consent to their marriage. But he took no part in it, and would not even leave his room. In vain did Tregamain try to persuade him to be present at the wedding. "You really ought to be there." "Indeed." "The young people do not like your being away. I beg that you will leave me in peace." And so the young people were married. They stayed at home only to leave it occasionally to visit the best of men, their friend Tregamain. There they often talked about Antifer and their sorrow at seeing him so irritated and cast down. He never went out. He saw nobody. No more walks for him on the ramparts. No more saunters along the quays, pipe in mouth. It was said that he was ashamed to show himself after such a failure, and there was a good deal of truth in this. "I am afraid his health will give way," said Enelgate, the tears coming into her eyes when she spoke of her uncle. "And so am I," said Nanan, "and every day I pray that heaven may grant that my brother may recover from his disappointment." "That horrid Pasha!" exclaimed Jules. "What did he want to throw his millions at us for?" "Particularly millions we could not find," said Tregamain. "But yet, they are somewhere. If only we could have made out the document to the end." One day, the bargeman said to Jules, "Do you know what I think, my boy?" "What do you think?" "That your uncle would have been less upset if he had learned where the treasure was, even if he could not have put his hands on it." "Perhaps you are right, Tregamain. What makes him angry is that he had in his hand the document indicating the position of island number 4, and yet was unable to decipher the last lines." "There would have been no mistake about it this time," replied Tregamain. "The document was explicit on that point. Uncle has got it. He has it always under his eyes. He spends his time in reading it over and over again." "A waste of time, my boy, a waste of time. We shall never find His Excellency's millions. Never." A day or so after the wedding, they learned the news of what had happened to that rascal Saouk. The reason that he had not got to Spitzenberg before the others was that he had been arrested at Glasgow. The day of his attack on Turcomel, he had started for Glasgow, where he hoped to find a vessel sailing for Drothheim or Bergen. Instead of starting from the east coast of Scotland, as Antifer had done, he would go from the west. The distance was much the same, and he hoped to reach the island before the legatees. Unfortunately for him, he had to wait at Glasgow for a week before his ship started. And fortunately for human justice, he was recognized just as he was going on board. He was immediately arrested, and being sent to prison, was saved from a useless voyage to Spitzenbergen. The days rolled on. Jules and Enegate would have nothing to mar their happiness had it not been for the truly melancholy state of their uncle. On the other hand, the young captain could not look forward without sorrow to the time when he would have to leave his wife and his friends. The bailiff's three-master was nearly finished building, and of her he was to be chief officer. It was a splendid position for a man of his age. In 6 months he would have to be at sea on a voyage to India. Jules often talked about these things with Enegate, who was always sad at the thought of being separated from her husband. But in seaport towns, are not families accustomed to these separations? Enegate, not wishing to talk about herself, preferred to look at the matter as affecting only Captain Antifer. Would it not be cause of regret to his nephew to have to leave him in such a state, particularly as it was doubtful if he would find him alive when he came back? Jules returned continually to the incomplete document, to the almost illegible lines in the old parchment. Yes, in these lines lay the beginning of a sentence which he tried again and again to decipher. all that is necessary is to bring what? And then these words, island, situated, law, geometrical, pole. What geometrical law? What was there that brought the three islands in connection? Had the Pasha chosen them at haphazard? Was it a mere whim that had sent the treasure seekers successively to the Gulf of Oman, Mayumba Bay, and Spitzenbergen? If the rich Egyptian had, as was reported, some knowledge of mathematics, had he been giving them some problem to solve? As to the word pole, did it mean the extremities of the Earth's axis? Certainly not. But then, what did it mean? Jules racked his brain to obtain some answer to all this, but in vain. Pole, pole, he repeated to himself. That is the key to the mystery. Often he would talk about this to the bargeman, who approved of his endeavors, for he had no doubt as to the existence of the millions. But, my boy, he would say, there's no need for you to make yourself ill and try to find the solution. Well, Tregamain, it is not for my own sake, I assure you. I care not a fig for the treasure. But my uncle? Yes, for your uncle, Jules. It is hard lines, certainly. To have there under his eyes the document, and not be able to... But have you no clue? No. And yet there is the word geometrical in the sentence. It would not be without some reason that it would be there. And then it says, all that is necessary is to bring... What? That is it. What? And there is the word pole, which I do not understand the sense of. Unfortunately, I do not understand anything about it. I might help you if I did. 2 months went by. There was no change with regard to Antifer, and none with regard to the solution of the problem. One day, it was the 15th of October, before breakfast, Endergate and Jules were in their room. It was rather cold, and a good fire was blazing in the grate. The young wife, with her hands in her husband's, was looking at him silently. Seeing him so absorbed, she wished to give another turn to his thoughts. Jules, said she, you often wrote to me during this unfortunate voyage, which has brought us so much trouble. I read your letters over and over again, and I kept them carefully. They can only recall unpleasant remembrances now, my dearest. Yes, but yet I have kept them, and I will always keep them. But these letters have not told me all that happened to you, and you have never told me about it yourself. Will you tell me today? What good would that be? It would please me. I should like to be with you on the steamers, in the train, in the caravan. My darling, we should have to have a map so that I can show you our route from point to point. Well, here's the terrestrial globe. Will that not do as well? Quite as well. Endergate went and brought the globe and set it on the table before the fire. Jules, seeing that it would please Endergate, sat down by her, turned the globe so as to bring Europe opposite to them, and pointed with his finger to the town of St. Malo. Let us start, he said. And to begin with, Jules passed from France to Egypt, where Captain Antifer and his friends had stopped at Suez. Then his finger ran down the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, and stopped at Muscat. And so Muscat is there, said Endergate. And island number 1 is close by. Yes, a little out in the Gulf. Then, turning the globe, Jules reached Tunis, where they met with the banker Zambuco. He traversed the Mediterranean, he stopped at Dakar, and he crossed the equator, descended the African coast, and paused at Mayumba Bay. That is island number 2, said Endergate. Yes, wifey. And then he went north again along Africa, and across Europe to Edinburgh, where he met Turkomel. Then his finger went further north until he reached the deserted rocks of Spitzenbergen. That is island number 3, said Endergate. Yes, island number 3, where we had the greatest disappointment we met with during this stupid adventure. Endergate said nothing, but kept her eyes fixed on the globe. Why did your Pasha choose these 3 islands, one after the other? That is what we do not know, and what we shall probably never know. Never? And yet these islands ought to be connected by some geometrical law, if we are to believe the last document. And then there is the word pole, which bothers me. As he spoke, Jules seemed to fall into a kind of trance, as though his whole mind was concentrated on the solution of this obscure problem. And while he remained silent, Enegate amused herself by tracing with her finger the route he had traveled. Placing her finger at Muscat, she moved it along to Mayumba, and then in the same curve ran up to Spitzenbergen, and returned to the point of departure. "That is a circle," she said with a smile. "You have been traveling on a round." "On a round?" "Yes, a circumference, a circular voyage." "Circular!" exclaimed Jules. He jumped up and took 2 or 3 turns across the room, repeating the words. "Circumference! Circumference!" Then he stepped toward the table, took the globe, ran his finger round it, and uttered a cry. Enegate was frightened, and looked at him anxiously. Was he going mad like his uncle? She looked and trembled, the tears in her eyes. Jules uttered a second cry. "I have found it! I have found it!" "What?" "Island number 4. Surely the young captain had gone out of his mind. Island number 4? Impossible. "Tregamain! Tregamain!" shouted Jules, opening the window and calling in his neighbor. Then he returned to the globe. A minute afterwards, the bargeman was in the room, and Jules greeted him with, "I have found it." "What have you found, my boy?" "I have found how these islands are geometrically connected, in the place that ought to be occupied by island number 4. "Can it be possible?" replied Tregamain. And looking at Jules, he wondered, like Enegate, if the young captain had gone mad. "No," replied Jules, who understood the look. "I have not gone out of my mind. Listen." "I am listening." "These 3 islands are situated on the circumference of the same circle. Join them, 2 and 2, by straight lines. Bring them together, as the document says, and raise a perpendicular from the middle of each line. The perpendiculars will meet in the center of the circle, and that is the central point, the pole where we shall find island number 4. A very simple problem of geometry, as we see, which Camelique and Captain Zo had put into practice. The solution had not previously occurred to Jules, because he had not noticed that the 3 islands occupied 3 points of the same circumference. And it was Enogate's pretty finger which had traced this thrice-blessed circumference and solved the problem. "It is not possible," said the bargeman. "It is so. Look again, and convince yourself." It did not take long to convince him. The young captain ran to and fro, no longer able to restrain himself, and kissed the globe, and kissed Enogate's 2 cheeks, which were much fresher than the painted cardboard, and said, "She found it, Tregamain. She found it. Without her, the idea would never have occurred to me." And then Tregamain became attacked by a sort of delirium jubilans. He began to kick out his legs and round his arms with the grace of a sylphide of 30 stone, and rolling from port to starboard more than he had ever done on the Charmante Amélie between the banks of the Rance, or on the Porte Alegre with a cargo of elephants, he roared out, "I have my long, long, long. I have my jid long jid. I have my long, have my jid. I have my longitude." But at length, he calmed down. "We must tell Uncle," said Enegate. "Tell him," said Tregamain, a little surprised at the proposal. "Is it wise for us to tell him?" "That requires reflection," replied Jules. They called Nanon. The old Breton was told how things stood in a few words, and when Jules asked if they ought to tell her brother, she replied, "We ought to not hide anything from him." "But if another disappointment awaits him," said Enegate, "he will not be able to bear it." "A disappointment this time?" "Certainly not." "The last document said the treasure was buried on island number 4, said Jules. And island number 4 is situated in the center of the circle we have traveled. I am sure of it." "I will go and see my brother," said Nanon. A moment afterwards, Captain Antifer appeared in the room, his eyes haggard, his look gloomy, his brows knit. "What is the matter?" he asked. Jules explained what had passed, how he had first discovered the geometrical line united the 3 islands, and the reason why island number 4 must necessarily be in the center of that circle. To the surprise of everybody, Antifer took matters quite coolly. He seemed to have been waiting for the news, as though nothing was more natural than that he should hear it sooner or later. "Where is this central point, Jules?" was all he asked. Jules placed the globe on the table. With a flexible rule in his hand, he joined Muscat to Mayumba, in Mayumba to Spitzenbergen. From the middle of each line he drew a perpendicular, and the perpendiculars crossed in the center of the circle in which the islands were placed. The center was in the Mediterranean, between Sicily and Cape Bon, close to the island of Pantelleria. "There it is," said Jules. "There it is." And carefully going over the position again, and noting the meridian and parallel, he said in a firm voice, 37 degrees, 26 minutes north latitude, 10 degrees, 33 minutes east longitude. "But is there an island there?" asked Tregamain. "There ought to be," said Jules. "Is there one there?" "That is it exactly, Tregamain," said Antifer in a voice that made the windows rattle. "Exactly. It wants but that." And he rushed out, shut himself up in his own room, and did not appear again during the day. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joseph DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 32. What did all this mean if Antifer had not gone mad? During the following days he resumed his walks on the ramparts and along the harbor, smoking his pipe and grinding away at his pebbles. He was no longer the same man. A sort of sardonic smile was stereotyped on his lips. He made no allusion to the treasure, nor to his travels, nor to the final expedition which would enable him to put his hands on the much sought-for millions. Tregamain and the others did not return to the subject. Every moment they expected Antifer to give them their marching orders, but he said not a word. "What can it mean?" asked Nanon. "A change has come over him," said Jules. "Perhaps he is afraid of having to marry Miss Sambuco," suggested the bargeman. "But that does not matter. It will never do to leave all those millions there." If Antifer's opinions had changed, it was evident that Tregamain's had. He it was who was now seized with thirst for gold. And yet he was logical. When they did not know if they would find an island, they went in search of it. Now that they knew where the island was, why should they not be off? Tregamain was constantly talking to Jules about it. "What is the use?" asked the captain. He spoke about it to Nanon. "Bah," said she, "leave the treasure where it is." He spoke to Enegate. "Look here, my little one, there's more than 1,000,000 to put in your pocket." "Well, Mr. Tregamain, there's a kiss for you, and that is worth more." At last he resolved to mention the matter to Antifer, and a fortnight after the last scene, he did so. "Ah, there's that island, What island?" "The island in the Mediterranean. It exists, I suppose." "Exists? I am more certain of its existence than I am of yours and mine." "Then why do we not go there?" Antifer's reply was so oracular that Tregamain tried in vain to understand it. But he was not discouraged. After all, the millions were not for himself, but for the young people who were not thinking of the future. He would think of it for them. And so he persisted, and one day Antifer said to him, "So it is you who want to go?" "Yes, I want to go." "Your opinion is that we ought to go." "We ought to go, and better today than tomorrow." "Very well, let us go." But before starting, it was necessary to come to some determination regarding Sambuco and Ben Omar. Their positions as co-legatee and executor required that they should be present at the discovery of island number 4, and they were invited to be at the island on a certain day, the one to take his share, other to take his commission. Antifer would have everything done in order. 2 letters were sent, to Tunis and Alexandria, making an appointment for a meeting to take place on the 23rd of October at Girgenti in Sicily, the nearest town to the island. Turcomel's share would be sent to him in due course, and he could do what he liked with it. Throw it into the Firth of Forth, perhaps, if he was afraid of it burning his fingers. When the voyage was decided on, no one will be astonished at Tregamain having to be one of the party. What is more surprising is that Enegate had also to go. Jules had only been married 2 months, and he would not consent to leave his wife behind. How long would this new exploration last? Not long. They only had to go and return. They had no 5th document to search for. It was certain that Camalik Pasha had not added other links to the chain of islands, which was long enough already. No, The statement was definite. The treasure was under one of the rocks at island number 4, and this island was mathematically placed between the coast of Sicily and the island of Pantellaria. Only it cannot be of much importance, for it is not marked on any of the maps, said Jules. Probably not, replied Antifer with a grin that would have done credit to Mephisto. Really, it was incomprehensible. It was decided to go by the shortest road, which was the railway. There existed already an uninterrupted line of rails across France and Italy, from St. Malo to Naples. Expense was no object, considering the millions that were in view. On the morning of the 16th of October, Nanon bade goodbye to the travelers, who started by the first train. At Paris, where they did not stop, they took the fast train to Lyons, crossed the Franco-Italian frontier, saw nothing of Milan, or Florence, or Rome, and reached Naples on the 20th of October. Tregemain was as confident of the result of this new expedition as he was exhausted by 100 hours of shaking in a railway carriage. Leaving the hotel in the morning, Captain Antifer and his companions took passage on a steamer sailing for Palermo, and after a fine day's crossing, landed in the Sicilian capital. Do not imagine that there was any talk of visiting the local attractions. This time, not even Tregemain thought of bringing away a fugitive remembrance of this last voyage, nor of piously assisting at those Sicilian vespers he had heard of. As far as he was concerned, Palermo was not the famous city captured in turns by Normans, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Englishmen. It was merely the point of departure of the public conveyances, which run twice a week to Corleone in 9 hours, and from Corleone to Girgenti, also twice a week, in 12 hours. It was at Girgenti that our travelers had business, and it was in this ancient Agrigentum, situated on the southern coast of the island, that they were to meet Zambuco and Ben Omar. This means of locomotion might be subject to certain incidents or accidents. The post roads are not very safe. There are still brigands in Sicily. There always are. They flourish like olive trees or aloes. But nevertheless, the coach started next day, and the journey was accomplished without adventure. They reached Girgenti in the evening of the 24th of October, and if they had not reached their goal, they were at least very near it. The banker and the notary were already there, one from Tunis, the other from Alexandria. O inextinguishable thirst for gold, of what art thou not capable? As they met, the co-legatees exchanged but these words. Sure of the island this time? Sure. But what a sarcastic tone was Antifer's reply, and what an ironical look he had in his eye. To find a boat of some sort at Girgenti was not difficult. Fishing boats there are many, and coasting vessels also. Balancels, tartans, feluccas, speronaires, and every other sort of Mediterranean rig. Besides, all they wanted was a short excursion on the sea, a mere trip of 40 miles or so to the westward. With a fair wind they could start that evening, and in the morning would be so near their island that they could land there before noon. The boat was soon engaged. Her name was the Providenza. She was a felucca of about 30 tons, commanded by an old sea-wolf, who in spite of his 50 years, still frequented these parts. And well he knew them. With his eyes shut, he could take a ship from Sicily to Malta, and from Malta to the coast of Tunis. There is no need to tell him what our business is, said Tregemain, and Jules thought it prudent not to do so. The name of the captain of the felucca was Jacopo Grappa, and it was fortunate for the travelers that he knew enough French to understand it, and make himself understood. And the travelers were fortunate in another respect. It was October. There were 1,000 reasons for expecting bad weather, a heavy sea, a cloudy sky. But no, the cold was already perceptible, the air was dry, the breeze blew from the land, and when the Providenza set sail, a magnificent moon poured its rays on the high Sicilian mountains. Grappa's crew consisted but of 5 men, enough for handling the felucca. The lifeboat flew over the quiet sea, a sea so quiet that even Ben Omar suffered no disturbance. The night passed without incident, and the dawn announced a superb day. Antifer's behavior was astonishing. He walked about the deck, hands in his pockets, pipe in mouth, affecting perfect indifference. Tregemain, in a great state of excitement, could hardly believe his eyes. The bargeman had taken up his position in the bow. Annegate and Jules were side by side, Annegate enjoying the charm of the voyage. Ah, why could she not follow her husband wherever the chances of his sailor's life would take him? From time to time, Jewel would stroll up to the steersman to see that the Providenza was keeping on her course due west. At the rate at which she appeared to be going, he reckoned that she would be at the desired place about 11 o'clock. Then he would return to Energate, a proceeding which once or twice brought him an admonition from Tregamain. Do not devote so much attention to your wife, Jewel. Give a little to our business. Notice that he said, our business. Oh, how he had changed. But was it not in the interests of his young friends? At 10 o'clock there was no sign of land, and in fact in this part of the Mediterranean, between Sicily and Cape Bon, there is no island of importance except Pantellaria. But they were not seeking an island of importance, nothing but an islet, a simple little islet. Grappa could not understand why the felucca was put on this course. Were his passengers bound for the coast of Tunis? But it did not matter to him. They had paid him well to go west, and he would go west as long as they asked him to. Are we to go west all the time? He asked Jewel. Yes. Very well. At 10:15, Jewel, sextant in hand, took his first observation. He found that the felucca was in latitude 37 degrees 30 minutes north, and longitude 10 degrees 33 minutes east. While he was at work, Antifer looked at him sideways and winked. Well, Jewel? We are in the right longitude. Now we have to drop a few miles to the south. Then drop a few miles, nephew. Drop. I fancy that we shall never drop enough. The felucca was put on the port tack, so as to approach Pantellaria. Old Grappa, with his eyes screwed up and his lips pressed together, was lost in conjectures, and when Tregamain came near, he could not help asking him, in a low voice, what they were looking for in these parts. A handkerchief we had lost here, replied the bargeman, as if he were getting out of temper, if so excellent a man could do so. Very well, senor. At 11:45, there was still no mass of rocks in view, and yet the Providenza ought to be on the site of island number 4. Nothing. Nothing as far as the eye could reach. Joe went up to the starboard shrouds of the masthead. From there he could see for 12 or 15 miles around him. Nothing. Always nothing. When he returned to the deck, Zambuco, flanked by the notary, approached to him, and in an anxious voice asked, Island number 4? It is not in sight. Are you sure of your position? Asked Antifer in a jeering tone. Sure. Then it would appear that you no longer know how to take an observation. Jewel flushed with anger, but Energate calmed him with a supplicating gesture. Tregamain judged it wise to interfere. Grappa, he said. Signor, we are in search of an islet. Yes, signor. Is there an islet anywhere near here? An islet? Yes. Do you mean an island? An island, said Antifer, shrugging his shoulders. Yes, an island. A pretty little island. An islet. An icky little islicky of an islet. Do you understand? Excuse me, Excellency. Are you really looking for an island? Yes, said Gildas Tregamain. Does one exist? No, signor. No? No. But there used to be one, for I have seen it, and landed on its surface. Its surface? Repeated the bargeman. But it has disappeared. Disappeared? Exclaimed Jewel. Yes, signor. 31 years ago, come San Lucia. And what was this island? Asked Tregamain, clasping his hands. Why, said Antifer, it was Graham's Island. Graham's Island? What a revelation to Jewel. Yes, it was Julia Island, or Graham's Island, or Hotham's Island, or Ferdinandia, or Nerita, whichever name you please, which had happened on this spot on the 28th of June, 1831. What doubt could there be as to its existence? The Neapolitan Captain Carraro had been present at the very moment of the submarine eruption which had produced it. Prince Pignatelli had observed the column which burst in the center of the newborn island, with a continuous light as if it were a firework. Captain Ireton and Dr. J. Davy had been witnesses of this marvelous phenomenon. During 2 months, the island, covered with ashes and hot sand, could be walked over. It was part of the seabed which plutonic forces had raised above the water level. In the month of December 1831, the rocky mass had sunk, the island had disappeared, and this portion of the sea had retained no trace of it. During this lapse of time, so short, Ill luck had led Camillic Pasha and Captain Zoe into this part of the Mediterranean. They sought an unknown islet, and they found one, which appeared in June and vanished in December. And now it was 50 fathoms down that the precious treasure lay. The millions which Turcomel would have hurled into the sea had got down into the sea of themselves and would never be spread over the world. And Captain Antifer knew this. When Jules, 3 weeks before, had given him the position of island number 4, between Sicily and Pantellaria, he had at once recognized it as Graham's Island. When he was a youngster at sea, he had sailed in these parts and knew all about the double phenomenon in 1831. The appearance and disappearance of an ephemeral island, now 300 feet below the level of the waves. When he had satisfied himself of this, after a fit of anger, the most terrible in his life, he had made up his mind to give up all hopes of ever obtaining the treasure of Camillic Pasha. And that is why he had not spoken of resuming the search. If he had consented, under Tregamine's insistence, if he had plunged into the expenses of another voyage, it was only for his own self-esteem, to show that he was not the greatest dupe in the matter. The appointment he had made with Zambuco and Ben Omar was to give them the lesson which their duplicity toward him so well deserved. Turning toward the Maltese banker and the Egyptian notary, he said, "Yes, the millions are there, under our feet, and if you want your share, you have only to die for them. Come, Zambuco. To the water, Ben Omar." And if ever these two regretted their acceptance of Antifer's invitation, it was when he overwhelmed them with sarcasms, forgetting that he had been as keen as they were in the search of the treasure. "And now for the eastward," said Antifer, "and for home, where we will live so happily," said Jules. "Even without the millions of the Pasha," said Enogate. "We shall have to do without them," added Tregamine in a tone of comic resignation. And meanwhile, the young captain, out of curiosity, asked for a sounding to be taken. Grappa obeyed with a shake of the head. When the line had run out to a little over 300 feet, the lead struck a resisting mass. That was Graham's Island. That was island number 4, lost at this depth. At Jules' orders, the felucca wore into the wind. The wind being ahead, she had to beat to windward all night, and the morning was well advanced when the Providenza moored alongside the quay at Girgenti, after this fruitless exploration. But as the passengers were taking leave of old Grappa, he said to Antifer, "Excellency? What is it? I have something to say." "Speak, my friend, speak." "Signor, all hope is not lost." Antifer drew himself up, and it was as though a look of supreme covetousness illuminated his glance. "All hope?" he answered. "Yes, Excellency. The island disappeared toward the end of the year 1831, but... It has been rising ever since 1850. Like the barometer when fine weather is coming," said Antifer, with a loud shout of laughter. "Unfortunately, when it appears with its millions, our millions, we shall not be here. Not even you, Tregamine, unless you die a centenarian many times over." "Which is hardly probable," replied the bargeman. "But it is true, as the old sailor said. The island is gradually rising to the surface of the Mediterranean, and a few centuries later it may be possible to have quite another ending to these wonderful adventures of Captain Antifer." The end. End of chapter 32. End of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey.